Saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. What should you be cooking with? We're going to be talking more about that today on Trees Philosophies. Welcome, everybody. This is Trees Philosophies. This is where I go deeper in on my thoughts, values, principles, meditations. People always told me I go too deep. Well, I go deeper, baby. Anyways, let's get into it. So today I'm joined by my brother John here, who is a specialist in health and fitness and biochemistry.
What's
And
up?
yeah, what's up? What's up? Thank you for joining me today, man. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you
Um,
for inviting me.
yes, and you have a very specific expertise in, again, as I said, biochemistry, health, fitness. John is a personal trainer,
Hmm.
and he has his own podcast that's focused on health and fitness. And he had an
State of
episode,
health.
State of Health. Yes, thank you. And he had an episode that he did that was very interesting to me that was focused on diet and nutritional guidelines. And of course, we hear about fats and saturated fats, unsaturated fats, vegetable oils, seed oils, and which one should you use? And he went over a study that essentially looked at data that was collected for a bunch of patients that were given saturated fats versus unsaturated fats, and their overall health was recorded afterwards to see what would happen. And of course, back in the 70s, there was a push away from saturated fats, right? There was a push away from fats like butters, things of that nature. And as a result, all those things were kind of shelved and put aside. And the thing is that a lot of these recommendations were based off of junk science in a sense. And to me, that's really interesting because it ties into the current times where we have so much faith that's put in science, so much faith that's put in the scientific method and in following the science. However, we do have to acknowledge that science comes down to people at the end of the day, and it's people that are carrying out these experiments. And people at the end of the day are flawed, whether it's in the applications of religion, of science, or whatever institution in politics. There's good people and there's bad people. And this study illustrates how any institution, whether it's an institution of science or whatever it may be, can be corruptible by the individuals that are in that institutions, by the people who have a certain narrative, who have a certain agenda to push, which we see unfold in this story. And that's why I wanted to bring John on, because he did a great job uncovering this. So I would highly recommend everybody to go and watch those episodes that he did, because he actually goes over the details, over the studies. He goes over everything super in depth, goes over the stats in a
Hmm.
very scientific manner. So
Hmm.
I really appreciated that. And again, to me, it was just really interesting, the whole implication of the current culture and the
Hmm.
broader narratives that are being pushed via science, and how, again,
Hmm.
it's just people are behind the science, and people,
Hmm.
they are corruptible because of egos. Our egos are easily corruptible because we have some sort of view that we're trying to portray to the world. But tell me more about this study. How did you come across it? And just, yeah,
Hmm.
what did you find interesting about it? Like, did your eyes pop when
Hmm.
you like first started reading it? Like,
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll tell you a little bit of a background story to kind of lead up to how I came across it. And this was I had already kind of come across kind of this information about how polyunsaturated fats are not necessarily as good for you as they're marketed. And so I would often just stay away from eating food products like vegetable oils or margarine and things like that, because I intuitively knew that they're not good for me, but I hadn't done as much deep digging, excuse me, into it. And
yes.
so a friend of mine who had just recently had a baby, they were talking to me about how they were getting margarine and all these kind of like heart healthy uh, fats to feed their kid with, cooking the food with for their kid, because there I can't exactly remember the details, but there was some sort of heart issue. It wasn't like critical or anything, but they wanted to be extra good parents and like make sure they got the heart healthy stuff. And so
Hmm.
immediately I like my red flag went off. I was like, are you sure about that? Like, I actually don't think that that's the best move that you could be making. And so the guy was super receptive, and he said, can you send me some information that I could read up on? And then that way I can basically like make a more informed decision. And so based off of that, I was like, yeah, absolutely. I went and did a quick little research, and I came across this article from the American College of Cardiologists. So cardiologists, they know a thing or two about heart health, right?
Right.
And that article is from, I actually have it in front of me here. It is from 2020. So it's pretty recent. So this actually happened very recently, the story. So this in this article, the cardiologist did an overview of all the evidence that's out there about. Oh yeah, so yeah, all the evidence that's out there whether saturated fat is bad for your health. They so this is actually the thing that my friends told me, is that they were afraid that the saturated fat from butter was going to be unhealthy, and that's why they were switching to margarine, because that's how they're marketed, is the margarine is more heart healthy. So they wanted to avoid the butter, which is full of
Right.
saturated fat, and get the margarine, which is full of polyunsaturated fat.
Mm-hmm.
So then from this journal of from the American College of Cardiologists, they do an overview of all the both the observational data and the experimental data, where they actually interject and change diets. And they look at, I think, over a total of 400,000 people included in all the studies together. And they show that there's actually no evidence, whether you're looking observationally or through experimentation, that saturated fat consumption is related to higher risk of coronary heart disease. So I shared that with him. And then to be fair, I also went and sought information that would prove the opposite. So there was another study I found, and it's titled Effects of Coronary Heart Disease of Increasing Polyunsaturated Fat in Place of Saturated Fat, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized control trials. So these are randomized control trials that apparently prove that when you switch from saturated to polyunsaturated fat, you actually have, and what they say is a 19% relative risk reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so when you actually look through the data, it's actually such a bad study where even the authors themselves, will rank the quality of all the studies that they put together. They rank them from 0 to 5, 5 being the highest, 0 being the lowest. The highest quality of all the studies, there were 8, was 3. Okay. Most of them were 2, only like a couple were 3. And when you take a look at the highest quality studies, there's no difference when they increase polyunsaturated fat versus saturated fat. And then furthermore, when you look at even more closely, when you look at all-cause mortality, right? They're specifically looking at coronary heart disease. But if you look at all-cause mortality, it's no different. So let me explain that a little further, because it's a little bit confusing. So if you're doing a diet intervention, let's say, and you're hoping that the diet intervention is going to reduce coronary heart disease, like heart attacks, death related from heart attacks, then that's great if that happens. But if you have an increase in other types of deaths, then is that actually better? My argument is no. If the all-cause mortality stays the same, then it doesn't matter if the heart attack related deaths have decreased. And if you look at it even further, the amount of increase in the polyunsaturated fat was immense. It was like a tripling of the total amount of polyunsaturated fat that they consumed, but it was only a 19% relative risk reduction. And that's another thing, is what you were talking about in relation to like how science is done, and how it's like a little bit confusing sometimes for people to quote unquote follow the science, because they use tricky terms like relative risk reduction, because it's not the same as an absolute risk reduction. Let me explain that. So let's say the risk of heart attacks is, let's say, 50%, right? If the relative risk reduction is 19%, then that doesn't mean you just simply take the 50% and subtract 19%, right? It wouldn't be like that. That would be an absolute risk reduction. If it's a relative risk reduction, then you have to find out what 19% of 50 is. So it's about 20%. So that would be 10, right? Something like 10. And so that's where it sounds a lot better when you say 19% relative risk reduction compared to a 10% absolute risk reduction.
Right. It's
And it was,
a.
yeah. And the
Mhm.
data they provide, they don't even, it doesn't let you figure out what the actual absolute risk reduction is. They obscure the data in a way where you can kind of only estimate what it could be. And by my estimation, it was only a 1 or 2% absolute risk reduction.
So in
So,
absolute terms, it's 1 to 2%. In relative
mhm,
terms, it's
mhm,
greater. So to make the numbers look better, you use the bigger
mhm.
one.
And
Yeah,
this
that's
is where I came across this Minnesota coronary heart experiment, the one that you wanted to talk about, because it's actually
mhm,
included in the list of studies in this study that's supposed to prove that changing polyunsaturated fat is
mhm,
better for heart health outcomes. So the interesting thing is there's like a bunch of small studies and then this one large study, which is the Minnesota coronary experiment. So all the small studies show like a little bit of benefit for introducing polyunsaturated fats into your diet, but it's so little, there's no statistical significance. And then you have this large Minnesota coronary heart experiment, which has like 9,000 people. Like all the studies together was something like 13,000. 9,000 of that is from this coronary heart experiment. And
mhm,
that one study shows that there's actually no difference, potentially a minor uh, harm actually from changing your
mhm,
diet to more polyunsaturated fats. According to that paper, which claims to prove that changing polyunsaturated fats is actually good for heart health outcomes. The largest study from that group of studies is the one that shows nope, that's not the case at all. So then I was like, all
yeah,
right, let's look into this a little bit deeper. Let's see what this is. And then you look into the study, and it has like this whole history. Like lots of people have done podcasts about this study because it's so interesting. So it was done in the late '60s, early '70s, '68 to '73, and it was one of the best control studies of all time because it was done at like medical wards at nursing homes where they have like these psychiatric patients or like really old patients that can't take care of themselves. And so you have full control of what they're going to consume.
mhm,
They're not going anywhere. They're always there. And they had a strict control for exact amounts of what they were going to have. And they blinded all the people who worked at these hospital wards. So they didn't know what was happening. The people doing all these statistics, everything was blinded really well. And this was the study that was done to absolutely prove the diet heart hypothesis. So let me
So could
take
you could
this.
you explain just for the benefit of anybody that's listening that might not
Mhm.
know, and what are examples of saturated and unsaturated fats aside from the obvious of like butter versus margarine?
Yeah. So a lot of saturated fat that humans consume comes from meat, actually. So fatty meat cuts from beef are actually full of saturated fat. Then
Mhm,
you've got, like you said, butter. You can also have saturated fat from tallow. So that's beef fat, rendered beef fat. Um, in terms of oils, I believe coconut oil is full of saturated fat, and palm oil. I don't use palm oil very much, but palm oil is full of saturated
What
fat. And
about
then ghee, of
avocado
course.
oil? Ghee, of course, yes.
Hmm.
Avocado oil. Somebody was telling me about that. Does that fall into the vegetable oil, the unsaturated?
It has some saturated fat, but it's a MUFA. It's a mono unsaturated fat. So it does have
Oh,
an unsaturation, but only a single. So the seed
okay.
oils that we'll be discussing in the Minnesota coronary experiment, they're polyunsaturated, meaning they've got more than one double bond, carbon carbon double bond.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. And again, other examples of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, aside from margarine,
So the main
are the.
ones I already list. Oh, I didn't list off. Sorry, are soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, sunflower, safflower oil, cottonseed oil. Those are the main ones.
Mhm. Okay, gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so yeah, all
Hmm.
those oils, avoid them. And
Well, yeah. Well,
why?
Yeah, that's a good
Why?
question.
Well, we're gonna
Why?
break it down.
Before I break it down, I was just about to tell you about the. So this Minnesota coronary experiment was
Mhm.
designed to provide the best possible evidence to support the diet heart hypothesis. So, what is the diet heart hypothesis? Is a real good question to ask, because it lies at the heart of why these recommendations have been made. Okay, so when coronary heart disease was becoming more prevalent and there's more studies done on it, there were certain risk factors that were determined that were very closely associated with higher coronary heart disease. The main ones were physical inactivity, smoking, high blood pressure, and high LDL cholesterol. Okay, so LDL cholesterol, what is that? Do you know what that
Mhm.
is? Should I explain that?
There's HDL, LDL,
Mm-hmm.
low density, lipo
Lipoprotein.
something. Yeah, there we
Yeah,
go.
lipoprotein.
I still got some of that
Yeah,
high school chemistry, a
yeah.
biology. Sorry, go ahead.
So so when someone checks your LDL cholesterol, they're checking your blood levels of LDL cholesterol, and they're doing that because your blood is your body's basically freeway or highway where it is able to provide all the energy that different parts of your body need, right?
Hmm.
So through your bloodstream, you have two sources of energy. You got glucose, and then you got fat. Now, glucose is hydrophilic. It can be in the bloodstream just fine. The fat is hydrophobic. It can't just be in the bloodstream. It needs a packaging molecule around it. It needs think of it like a boat. It needs something that can carry it around. So that's what this low density lipoprotein or high density lipoprotein. There's all sorts of different lipoproteins that have different functions in the body. And so LDL cholesterol is talking about the amount of cholesterol that is found in these LDL, low density lipoprotein particles that are carrying cholesterol, but also fat molecules. They're called triglyceride molecules, but basically fat molecules that will provide energy for your body. They're carrying all this around your body, providing energy for you. And it just so happens that for some people, when you measure LDL cholesterol and they have high levels of LDL cholesterol, there's an association with also high levels of coronary heart disease. And so, and this comes back to the point you're making about science again. A lot of science is reductionist thinking. We try to make things a little bit more simple so that we can understand it better and see if we can manipulate things and learn something, right? But we can't just stay in the reductionist thinking. We have to also get back to a bigger picture and try to kind of see the forest before the trees, because the model that we use is often incomplete, right? So somebody was like, oh, high LDL is associated with high heart disease. And we know that if you change saturated fats for polyunsaturated fats, your LDL goes down. So that must be good for your heart. But so
Hmm.
with studies, we can show definitively if you change saturated fat to unsaturated fat in your diet, you will lower your LDL. But it's never actually been shown that when you lower your LDL through diet like that, that you actually have an impact on your heart disease outcomes. It's always, in most studies, no statistical significance and no improvement in coronary heart disease outcomes.
And
And
if you guys watch my other video on statistical significance, then you should know what that means. And if you didn't, go check that out, because
mhm,
this is
mhm,
where those things are actually important. Because if it doesn't meet that threshold, then in essence,
mhm,
it's just nor here nor there. It's just we
mhm.
don't know. It's just
and
random.
and and this was the study done to make sure you gather enough evidence. It's perfectly powered. There's like over 9,000 people in this study. It was perfectly controlled. Everything was done right to make sure that you can show a statistical significance between the control and diet group. And they jacked up the amount of polyunsaturated fats in the in the intervention group quite significantly. They tripled the amount in the then in the control group. And just to even like mess with things a little bit too, is for the control group, they had some trans fats in there, but not for the intervention group, just to mess with the control group and make it seem worse than it actually is. So
Right.
most people know that
So
trans
the
fats have been like discontinued, and most food products are not allowed to have trans fats in them. But so the
mhm,
control group had saturated fats and trans fats, but the
mhm,
intervention group did not have the trans fats and had the saturated fat replaced with polyunsaturated fat. So
mhm, mhm.
that's
So
another
just
thing that you have
further
to really tease out.
demonstrating.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Which really goes to show how the devil is truly in the details, because if you're just taking a cursory look at a study, you might miss those types of important things. But then when you're actually looking at the details, it's like, oh, wow, that's actually a very relevant factor.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
if you
So
don't,
this study was done in the late 60s, early 70s. Then it part of the results were like um, they were at a conference. They were presented at a conference, but not published till like nearly 20 years later in the late 80s. And then, um, like, basically, the files were actually kept for a long time. And the son of one of the principal investigators is the one who had it. There's an interesting story behind this. But so basically, these other scientists who were doing like research on polyunsaturated fats like wanted to look into why this study never got published, like because part of the results got published, not the full set. So they started like asking around, trying to interview some people to see who
mhm,
had the raw data, and they were able to find some of it, not all of it, but a good chunk of it from the son of one of the principal investigators. And this guy was like a super nice guy because he could have definitely hidden, his dad's like, almost like dirty secret, because like this, it was
skeletons.
just like the proof was there, like staring them in the face, telling them, no, you're wrong. Your hypothesis is wrong. Try something different, but they didn't want to look at it. They just kind of just pushed it away. And
Mhm. Right. So, so just to back up, what happened was they had this data. They did the research. They got the results, and they had a preconceived narrative or theory. Essentially, their
mhm.
theory was, okay, we're gonna lower the saturated fats. That's gonna lower their cholesterol. That's gonna
LDL
like
cholesterol.
that's going to
Hmm.
lower their LDL, and that's going to lead to overall health in terms of
Coronary heart disease.
coronary heart disease and things like that. But
Hmm.
what happened was they found that there was no impact, in fact. And instead of publishing this information, they decided to shelve it, hide it, and
Hmm.
only
Not just no
and
impact.
but it's almost even worse because they didn't even just not publish it. They published a part of it. To me, that's almost even worse because you know that you like you're just so like manipulating the data. Like, oh, it's just so bad because you're taking okay,
Hmm.
this stuff shows what I wanted to show. This other stuff doesn't. So I'm gonna hide that here. This stuff I'm gonna
Hmm.
publish. And it's just like,
Hmm.
wow, it's just
So,
amazing. Sorry, please
so
continue.
part of the reason why I think they hit it was because it doesn't just show no difference. It actually shows that in the age group of 65 and older, there's actually an increase in mortality compared to the control group. And so this is a
Hmm.
really cool study because it's one of the few studies that actually includes both women and people over the age of 65 in the study. A large proportion of people in that participated belong to those two categories, and that's like we take it for granted that like studies are done on everybody, but it's actually not true. Their studies are generally done on a small cross section of people, and then we extrapolate that to be the same for like other people, but it might not necessarily be. In this case, they actually tried it on a like it was experimented on a whole variety of people, and the age group over the age of 65 was definitely uh, through like experiencing a higher rate of fatality than the control group. It's very clearly visible on that in the data.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight the what you stated before about the whole all cause mortality, because I think that might be a term that isn't used as frequently when the media discusses these things.
Hmm.
And I think it's an important term because it gives like a big picture overview of the situation, because essentially it's telling you like, okay, well, maybe mortality dropped as a result of coronary heart disease in this case, because that's the thing that you're looking at. But when you take a step back and you look at the all cause mortality, what happened, because then that's going to tell you the full picture. It's not enough for just the measured deaths to drop in the specific cohort or in the specific thing that you're looking at, if it's heart disease, if it's brain, whatever, lung, but
Hmm.
rather the all cause. Because okay, it's great that you fix the one problem, but you don't want to be that mechanic that fixes one problem but then causes another two problems you have to then fix, because what benefit was the solution if the solution is worse
Hmm.
than the actual problem itself? So this is kind of where we have to make sure we don't put the cart before the horse, in a sense, right? And that's why I think this all cause mortality term is so important to highlight, because it
Hmm.
really isn't something that's spoken about, but however
Hmm.
it can truly give that bigger perspective, the
Hmm.
greater understanding of the situation. And that's one of those things that when you measure and look at the situation, the all cause mortality didn't change. So therefore
Absolutely.
so so what do you like, I guess we want to kind of be fair perhaps to the person that was doing the
Charitable.
study, charitable. But what do you think? Do you think that they do you think it's a fair criticism to say that they shelved the data because it went against their theory, went against their narrative, and there was egos at play here? Or do you think there was something else happening?
I can't say I don't have any like information other than what I've kind of heard, and for what I understand, Ansel Keys was a driven individual. He was the main guy behind the diet heart hypothesis. It was his hypothesis, so he wanted to like make sure that he got um, notoriety for like his ideas. I think
And
all of
he
us are
ran this,
like
and he
that.
was the one of the principal researchers, right?
Yeah, he was the main guy. Him and I can't
So you
remember
have
the
all
name of
the
the second guy.
ingredients. You have all the ingredients. So you have a driven individual. He has a theory or a hypothesis that he's trying to
Prove.
push, prove in the
Hmm.
real world, right? And then you have the perfect opportunity with a huge data set, a huge experiment, a huge control group. So it has on the facade the capacity to illustrate a proper experiment, done by a figurehead that's got a respectable name. And it's got all the ingredients for high corruption almost. And just again, I want to tie it back into the more broader narratives that are at play here, where you see so much faith and emphasis that's put into science and the scientific method and process. But meanwhile you realize with examples like this, and this is just one of many, that demonstrate how science is easily corruptible by the people that do it, because we do have an ethical branch in science that goes over these things to assure that they are done with proper ethical standards. However, again, at
Hmm.
the end of the day, when there's lots of money to be made, when there's lots of reputations, right? Reputations on the line here. That's why you have people that are willing to take such measures, and who knows the impact that that's had. Somebody's ego, that, and then all of a sudden we have recommendations that are pushed onto people, because we've all heard of how margarine is, a better alternative than butter. Everybody kind of heard that growing up, but however, now you're slowly starting to see that wall being broken down. And I hope
Hmm.
this conversation will be one of those blows to that wall, so that way we get more people
Hmm.
to realize of how, in fact, unhealthy these things are. Just, as you
Hmm.
said, they're not just no impact. Sometimes they can be actually like a negative impact, which is pretty nuts.
Hmm. Yeah, and I want to kind of address maybe what when you're talking about the science. I think the science has become this like weird term with weird connotations, and I think there's a couple things that mean science, and like one of them is what people, when they say the science, they're talking about like what we think we know today. But then when I say science, what I'm talking about is the actual approach to asking questions, to hypothesizing, to like making predictions, the philosophy or science, the actual like part of science where you're able to use that reductionist thinking and think about like things on simple terms and come up with some ideas and test those ideas and and come up with some results and conclusions and more questions. That's what science really is. And then we have like the total amount of facts, let's say, that we think we know today, which, by the way, 50% of what we know is false. We just don't know which 50. And that's true at all times. Right. So it's, as a scientist, you're supposed to keep that in mind and know that the model that you have in your mind for what you think you're seeing is a good explanation for what you think you're seeing, but it's not full. It's not complete. There's always going to be a new model that explains what you're seeing as good as what your model currently does, but even more for certain questions that you have that your model doesn't answer currently. That's always the case. And so all this, like, to say that this comes down to simplistic thinking. Oh, LDL high is associated with bad health outcomes. Let's bring it down. Let's not think about the second, third order effects of what could be happening with LDL. This whole idea of good cholesterol versus bad cholesterol. How could something inside you be bad for you? LDL cholesterol is carrying cholesterol molecules to different parts of your body that need cholesterol. Oh, by the way, every cell in your body, the surface of that cell has cholesterol components. Oh, by the way, most of the hormones in your body are made from cholesterol. Oh, by the way, some neurotransmitters in your brain need cholesterol as a starting molecule. These things are super important for your body. LDL lipoprotein itself is involved in like immunity. It's got a whole host of functions that it does. If you're reducing that, you're not just reducing like the possible chance of reducing your risk of heart attack, but you're having a whole host of different impacts on your body. So you have to think about what are the actual like full second, third order effects, not just like what your simplistic model tells you it might be.
Yeah,
Sorry
it's
for the
like
rant.
very unidimensional, right? It's like you have a multivariate problem where it's a bunch of different variables that impact the result, but we hyper focus on one variable and try to optimize for it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a unidimensional way of thinking because it really I try to catch myself when I do this as well, but it's one of those things where it's so easy because it's just like, okay, one variable, fix this, is going to lead to some result. But in reality, there's so much going on. There's so many different things at play that it's like a host of things. And I always remember some of the courses I would take that were on like modeling, and we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
like model different types of events, like for example storm events, and you have these algorithms and you're trying to overlay what your response is going to be for your model in relation to the historical data, right? Because if your model reacts accurately, it should mimic what the historical data was. But with these
Mm-hmm.
models, there's many variables that you have to adjust in order to get it to respond and mimic the historical data. And what would happen is, one lesson that I learned was like when you try to hyper optimize for one variable, that one variable might match. So, say for example, I don't know if it was either precipitation, or if you're trying to match for the porosity of the soil in order to measure how quickly it would dissipate from the surface and go below ground, right? These are all variables you can tweak, and maybe you might tweak that one variable and get it super
Mm-hmm.
accurate for that, but then
Mm-hmm.
it's going to lead to all these other
Mm-hmm.
fluctuations, and all these other things are actually going to be way off. Now you optimize for that one variable, but your whole model is way off,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like it makes you take a step back and understand, okay, there's more things that have to optimize here than just
It's a
this one
concept of
variable.
trade-offs. Concept of
Exactly.
trade-offs. You can't
Ooh.
optimize for one thing and then have another thing also equally optimized. There's always trade-offs. You can't be the biggest and the fastest. You can only be the biggest or the fastest. Like once you optimize for one thing, the others have to suffer.
Hmm.
Other
Yeah,
qualities
exactly,
have to suffer.
exactly. Yes, the law of optimization, if that is a law. Now it is. Also, yeah, just what you were saying about like science and how I like how you put it, where it's like it's a verb essentially. It's not a noun. It's not a noun of a thing of a fact necessarily, but it's a process through which we
Hmm.
come to a better understanding.
Yeah,
It's a
we
way of
make
wrestling.
observations.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We make observations, and then we, based on hypotheses, we make some sort of theories, and we
Try to
document.
recognize
We
patterns.
process, try to recognize patterns. Exactly. And one of the biggest things that I think, honestly, that is left out when we talk about the scientific process, I think, anyways, is the reproducibility of it, and that's when you have. Or that's why in the scientific process you have such a high level of documentation, right? That's why you document your methodology, you write how you went through the sequence of steps, so that
Hmm.
others can read and then reproduce what you've done. But
Hmm.
that transparency, I see that as lacking, and it just, for example, with with hiding data in that sense, or the methodology in terms of like who you give to, or even for example, in this study where they gave the control group, they gave them diets that had the the trans fats in it, and just like how that skewed things, and just like how if you weren't aware of that, you wouldn't even know that that was actually influencing the data in a negative way. And you just like, yeah, it's just so much documentation needs to be done. We need to reproduce, and
Hmm.
if that transparency isn't there to allow the next scientist to read it and then redo your test and then say, hey, I actually showed the same things, then
Hmm.
that's not science to me. That's just trash. I don't know. Like,
There's definitely lower value or lower quality than if, like, yeah, it's really hard to understand from the manuscript what you did and how we can reproduce what you're talking about. If
hmm.
that's not there, then yeah, I consider that low value, low quality, not worth my time. And a lot of times recently, I have been, when I'm looking at new articles to look through, like it's most people skip through the methods section. That's the most important part to read through. People want to see the
Right.
results. You want to see the conclusions. What the hell are they talking about? Is this like what is the outcome of this study? But if you don't look at the methods, what does it
Hmm.
matter what the results and conclusions are? Because how can you know that the results and conclusions are actually in line with with what they've actually done? Because if you don't know what they've done, then yeah, like you're just you're dark, you're blind, you don't know anything. You got to look
Right.
at the methods and make sure that what they do is actually it makes sense with the claims that they make. Like the
Right.
claims that they made in that one paper where they are talking about how polyunsaturated fats are better or not better, but they improve. They have a 19% relative risk reduction for coronary heart disease. It's like, get out of here. There's 13,000 people in all combined, and 9,000 of them are from this one study that shows no, that's not true. How can you make that claim? And all the other
Hmm.
studies are not statistically significant.
Hmm.
Just because you put
Yeah,
a
it's
whole bunch of
crazy.
stuff together that,
Hmm.
and it was all these studies, like some of them were actual intervention studies where they gave people food, and some of them were just um, guidance, like just nutritional guidance, someone talking to you and giving you information, and then you're supposed to go and follow that. And they put all those studies
Right.
together. How can you put that together? That doesn't make any sense. Some studies you're actually giving food, some studies you're just giving guidance. Like you read that, and you're like, okay, well, I can't trust what the conclusions and results are, right?
Right.
But if you don't read the methods and don't read the explanation of how they did the study, it's like, oh, okay, it must make sense. It must be true.
Hmm. Hmm. And that's all uncovered in the methodology. And it's like my thesis supervisor, she would say, garbage in, garbage out. You know, if you
100%.
get garbage inputs, then you're gonna get garbage outputs if that methodology hasn't been properly thought out. And That's one of the most interesting parts of the scientific process is setting up the experiments, and once you start to see how the design of experiments actually works, how you manipulate different variables, and unfortunately, it's one of those more technical, more boring sides of the science that people maybe skip on. So that's why it's not highlighted. But at the end of the day, that's where the kind of the bread is buttered in a sense. All right, man. This was a pretty a good discussion. I think we went into a lot of good stuff here. Just recap, we went over these studies that talked about the saturated versus polyunsaturated fats, your natural butters, your ghees, your animal fats versus your vegetable oils, your
Seed oils.
seed oils specifically. And
Vegetable oil is just a marketing term. Remember that.
right, vegetable oil exactly. It's just
It
marketing
sounds nice.
crazy.
It's just vegetables. How could it be bad for you?
The crossroads of science and marketing. That's where you get terms like that, essentially. And
Hmm.
yeah, just how we had egos, we had theories, we had narratives that were pushed, and unfortunately it led the western diet down this path that
Hmm.
feared saturated
Hmm.
fats for so long, and
Hmm.
only after many decades where we've had opportunities to go back, revisit things, and
Hmm.
properly assess things, now we've seen how this information had been hidden from the people. And it's just yeah, I really hope the main takeaway for people is that at the end of the day, we're all science is a process, it's a verb, it's an action,
Hmm.
it's a
Hmm.
methodology, and at the end of
Hmm.
the day, it's conducted by people. People are corruptible just as they are if they are a part of a religious institution, same if they are in a scientific institution or a political institution. People can be corruptible, and egos can drive them towards doing things that preserve their egos, preserve their narratives, preserve their theories. Because reputation is strong, is a strong driver for people. Anything else you want to add on before we close this off?
Um, just if you're really interested about the stuff, go check out my podcast, State of Health. I've done 4 episodes on the subject, going over 4 different papers that really kind of go in depth into this. And then the last episode is about what are like actually the most closely associated risk factors to heart disease, more so than LDL cholesterol. And that's a really good one because in that one you learn that like triglycerides and HDL cholesterol levels, if you measure those are a way better marker of kind of giving you an idea of where you stand with regards to heart health than
Hmm.
looking at LDL cholesterol. So that's worth
Nice.
checking out.
Yes, so I'll definitely make sure to link all those extra videos as well. I highly recommend everybody go check them out. You went into way more detail in those videos. So if you're into that kind of stuff, there's much more nerdy, good content to be consumed. I highly recommend it. Thanks again, my brother. Jmart Fit at Instagram. I'll have those links as well. Appreciate it. And I'll catch you later, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Peace out, my brother.
Peace.